Today we're answering the question, can you take an old pre-built PC, slap in a graphics card and a different operating system, and suddenly have yourself a fairly okay gaming PC? So, one of the more requested videos on this channel was upgrading this old Dell XPS that we got a little while ago. I mean, I got scammed on it and overpaid far too much, but what does matter is, can we make this a bit of the ultimate Dell XPS with just a few upgrades? So first things first, let's get this open and see what we can actually do with it. Now it's worth noting I have wanted to do something with this system for quite a while because at the moment I just left it running Windows Vista because at least it was able to do something when running a retro operating system. But inside, as a refresher on the specifications, it came with a weird RAID setup on the hard drives, this abysmal looking OEM terascale based graphics card I believe, and actually an okay power supply unit that can deliver 385 watts. So actually a somewhat okay power supply. The question we've got today is what can we actually put in here to try and give it a little bit of a boost, and I've got a couple of ideas. So step one, let's get that awful graphics card out of here. I want to say from the top of my memory this was a HD 6670, and we did see some okay performance out of it, but it's not the graphics card this system should have came with. I bought this as a top spec one, so it should have come with a 6950 or something like that, and we just didn't get it. How does that come out? Like that. We don't need it anymore. What did we have as our RAM configuration? We had 2 gigs, and I'm assuming that's another 2 gigs. Yep, 2 gigs and 2 gigs. We can get rid of those. We don't need those. I bought these 4 gig sticks because they work really well on LGA 775 when nothing else I've tested actually does. The CPU I believe was actually an okay Core i5, so we're going to leave the Core i5, and then we want to run SSD. And now, the big one, we want to actually add a better graphics card. We simply throw in the R9 Nano. Now that is a hefty upgrade over the abysmal turd that was in here. A lot of dust. We're nearly done. So now we can put that upright. It's on. Let's just plug in a monitor real quick because then comes the big surprise, because that's also something that's been very requested. Double check if we get a display. Do you fancy giving us a signal? Let's see if it's still booting on the other graphics card. Maybe it's something else we've done. Plug in this turd again and see if it does anything with this. Yep, it's worked straight away. I wonder if we need a BIOS update. You know it's a curse when it only wants to work with Windows Vista and a terascale card. I'm really hoping it's not already on the latest BIOS. It is, on the latest BIOS. All I've done is take it out and plug it in again. It works. That's fine. Good enough. Right, so just to recap, we have actually got a somewhat okay Sandy Bridge Core i5 in here. That bit can stay. We put the RAM up to 16 gigs using whatever random DDR3 I had lying around, and we've also thrown in the R9 Nano. Now Polaris I can understand having issues because it is a new card that does need a full UEFI BIOS. Well, that's actually a contradiction in itself, but the point remains, it's just not going to work here. The thing is, the R9 Nano, and the reason I bought it, is because it should work in all of these old systems and is still really insanely powerful and very small. So, we've actually now got what should be a competent system. But we aren't going to be running elementary OS, and we're not going to be running Windows Vista. In fact, we're not even going to be running Windows 11. Because it is so heavily requested, we are going to be running Bazite again. But this time it should be a bit better. We've got 4 cores, we've got more RAM, and we also have a GCN graphics card. So can this be the ultimate gaming system by just shoving in some RAM and a graphics card and then chucking Linux on it? Just not this version here. I just like this version because it looks good. There we go. Install. Wonderful. That was quite simple. I just needed to set it to MBR, which meant they can boot on an older computer. But this should install, and this should include drivers for this graphics card and the rest of the system. And I think this is a fairly good test of a couple of things. One, the upgradability or official upgradability of an old Dell XPS, because you can keep the i5 in there, that's fine. You can keep these hard drives as storage. You can bung in an SSD. You can throw in 16 gigs of RAM for next to nothing. That is just junk RAM that I had lying around. And then you can throw in a small graphics card. Admittedly, finding an R9 Nano might prove a little bit harder but you can still find them and you can still get them, and there are viable alternatives to these. So it does unfortunately appear that there's no way that we can install Bazzite on a system that doesn't have UEFI. There are probably some workarounds and bodges, but in the meantime, it was brought to my attention in the last video I did that covered Linux about CachyOS, and apparently for older hardware, this could actually be better. The ETA was 10 minutes, it's now gone down to just over a minute and a half, so hopefully this isn't too long. I mean, this should work fairly well, shouldn't it? We have got the AMD graphics card, we've got the quad-core processor, we've got plenty of RAM, and we've got an SSD. So this should work. Welcome to CachyOS. Thank you for joining our community. We, the CachyOS developers, hope that you have a good time using the operating system as much as we enjoyed building it. But this is the thing, I want to get a good basis and understanding on various systems on how Linux performs with different configurations so we know if we should use it as an operating system, because as we've seen before, Windows 11, the IoT version, has been a good go-to for budget hardware for a little while now. We tested it on just 4 gigs of RAM with a cheap bundle, and it was fine. Let's see if that installs, and then we've actually got a modern operating system on here. Because at least the argument you could make is this is actually supported and developed for. Windows 11, as much as it will run well on this hardware, isn't officially supported. So this is technically the most modern viable option you can go for, but I think we'll have to take another look at this on Windows after we've done this video. So it took around 15 minutes or so to download the bulk, I'm assuming, and the rest of it is just downloading things like Hook or Blub or Gurg or whatever it was saying it was doing. I don't know what happened there, but it seems to be working this time. Not everything can always be perfect, that's why we're trying these things. But let's open up Terminal first of all and actually double check what graphics drivers we've got. R9 Fury Nano, AMD GPU, EGL, Vulkan 1.5. Right, these drivers all look good. That's the main thing I wanted to double check, is that it actually comes with working and up-to-date drivers. Well, we've got Kden Live, we've got OBS, we've got VLC. How do we get Steam? I say how do we get Steam? I know I can get Steam on here. I just got to try and remember the commands. So within no time at all, we did actually have the entire distro set up and ready to work. So out of the box, you get your graphics drivers, you get a basic set of applications where you can click and choose what else you want to install while the operating system downloads and sets itself up, and it was all very smooth from here on out. The main thing was trying to get Steam on here, where after a quick bit of googling I realised I don't have to go through and do it the old manual way through Terminal. You can just bring up the welcome menu here and select the gaming packages. And the gaming packages download all your Proton that you need for converting DirectX calls into Vulkan, and I actually found the versions included tended to work quite well. But within no time at all, we'd got everything all set up, the computer was upgraded, and we finally had a Linux-based distro on here, ready to go. So just what was my experience completely out of the box after we'd done nothing more than install the operating system and the associated gaming packages. Was it really just that simple? I'm not saying I'm becoming a fan of Linux, but certainly the tweaking aspect and getting it all working has been a lot of fun. Okay, we're running at 300 FPS straight off the bat. This is going a lot better than last time. Okay, this is a lot smoother than it was last time. There's been no hitching, no stuttering. I like how Half-Life 2 has now become our de facto benchmark of is this hardware running? But this could be a complete polar opposite to our last Linux video, where things were a little bit underwhelming. We might have to start bringing back Linux benchmarking. We might have to throw together a Linux test system that is just going to have to sit there and be the Linux test bench. Yeah, this is running great. This is running dead smooth. Then again, it's using Vulkan on a card that benefits from Vulkan. I'm going to have to retest the Fury. Now, we are dropping down to slightly under 100 FPS here in the larger, more open areas. Oh, is that a graphical glitch? That's something. Is that a large thing saying error? Well, I don't know what's happening there, but... oh, it was something to do with the train. Well, other than that minor issue, we're all set to get on with the rest of the video. This is working perfectly. Well, let's carry on. So after that rather successful test run, it got me a little bit curious on just how far the system could be pushed, because clearly the AMD card was benefiting here, and I don't think anyone is really disputing that a lot of these older GCN cards really do gain a lot of performance when they're running in versions of Vulkan, and to be fair, and in their credit, DirectX 12 as well on the Windows side, when at least it's got support from its drivers. The fortunate thing is, here on Linux, the R9 Fury is still supported, so that driver side issue, well, it simply doesn't exist here. And as I was going through and testing things, everything seemed to be working perfectly fine. Up until I thought, you know what, we're just about ready to start the benchmarks. I've got all the tweaking programs done, I've tweaked the graphics card around so it uses less power just because I was a bit worried about the power supply. Not that I really needed to be, because it can provide well over 400 watts safely, and even at full load this thing doesn't surpass 150 watts, but anyway, I'm going on a tangent there. The issue became, I then spent 2 hours chasing a problem in GTA 5. And just what is that problem, you're wondering? Well, every time you tried to access the settings menu, it would make it look like the system had completely died with a graphical artifact on screen that just made no sense. I mean, I could tell it wasn't something happening to do with the operating system, because if you pushed the shutdown button, or changed away from the process that was running GTA 5, the entire underlying OS was completely fine. And it turns out, after doing a bit of googling, this is just a common problem with GTA 5 on certain systems, mostly older systems to be fair, like this one, where when you try and go into the settings menu, it makes it look like your graphics card has died. Nope, that is a genuine issue here, and it is to do with some versions of Proton, but in my experience I tried different versions like Proton version 10, the experimental, the hotfix version, and it would all do a similar thing. See, I could change the graphics settings manually. If I went through the CFG file and changed them all one by one, we could get in game and we could see that it was completely playable. But there's so many options in the Enhanced Edition that I was going in a little bit blind, and it was a bit annoying. But still, other than that minor issue, everything was all working completely smoothly. Right up until I left the PC overnight, and it decided that it was not very happy about absolutely anything. Well, despite my attempts to actually get everything working here, and how promising everything seemed at first, my biggest mistake was letting the PC go through updates and sort itself out overnight. Because it's broken absolutely everything. I don't know how many Steam games it's broken, I don't know how many bits of the operating system it's broken. To be fair, it actually does seem quite stable on the operating system side, but I have no idea what's going on, and it's just failing to update things, failing to run the correct versions of Proton. When I do get things running, they are running well. Like, I'm not complaining about the performance here. It's a good proof of concept that this maybe was a good idea, but for the sake of ease, I'm just going to whack Windows on this now, and we're going to see how it does on Windows, because we've got the hardware upgrades, we've seen how it performs in a couple of operating systems already, but this was just not it, unfortunately. So why don't we go ahead and get Windows whacked on here now. Honestly, it's a bit of a melancholic note, to be honest, because I was really looking forward to seeing just how good this system could have been with that AMD graphics card, which, to be fair, I was loving how much control I had on the overclocking, undervolting, all the power states, the monitoring. It was fantastic over on the Linux side. It's just a shame that ultimately, one, I didn't need to be doing that. This thing could run absolutely fine, and that was just Linux causing those issues. And number two, well, the fact it's all gone wrong because I left it overnight. Usually I leave it overnight because there are updates that need doing, and when you get 22 megabits per second, the size of games now, you need to leave them. I do understand that it's one of the big things to do right now is to shit on Windows, and I don't blame people. It has a lot of problems, and in its natural form, when it's just base Windows 11, I am not a huge fan. But you strip it right back and just give me a start bar and an internet browser, and that is the operating system. Now that's Windows I can get along with. That's Windows I don't mind using, and it's also Windows that doesn't consume a ton of resources. So, I understand the disdain towards Windows, but once again, the IoT version is definitely my favourite version in recent years because it runs so well, it works on every bit of hardware I've tried it on, and it is just so lightweight compared to even the later versions of Windows 10. So, it's a shame Linux didn't work, but within no time at all, at least we'll have an operating system that should work, actually on here. A few updates, we'll let those go through. There's a few drivers in there. Wonderful, those are downloading. And then we're all good to go. Let's just whack some drivers on here after these ones have actually installed. Given the slight disappointment of the Linux tests, it was at least nice that everything seemed to work absolutely fine here on Windows 11 IoT. So we went through and we installed the latest modified drivers for the R9 Nano, just to give us the best chance we had of things working. And it is worth me saying this for people that are going to be complaining that I'm now testing on Windows. I am going to give the Linux drivers for these cards a very clear win here. Despite the issues I ran into on the Linux side of gaming, I have no complaints about the up-to-date drivers these cards still get over on the Linux side, and I really do need to take a more in-depth look at a lot of these cards on a system that is purely set up and ran in a dedicated way for Linux at some point, so we will get around to that. But in terms of this Dell XPS system, with the upgrades we've made, well, with the modified drivers, the R9 Nano set up and undervolted and underclocked for the sake of efficiency, we even achieved a legendary score in 3D Mark's Time Spy, of which it ran through completely fine. So with all of that out of the way, this Dell XPS now features 16GB of RAM found in a drawer, a 240GB SSD for booting from, an R9 Nano which is set up with the modified drivers, and it also includes the legendary Sandy Bridge i5, which is the weird i5-2320 I believe, or it's around that sort of number, I can't remember the exact figure. Either way, what you need to know is, it is a weird system we've thrown together here, with a graphics card that's sort of overkill and a PCIe slot that really was never geared up for this much power. But you know what? At the end of the day, this goes to prove an interesting point. Can you still take one of these old Dell XPS PCs and use the old trick of bung in an SSD, some RAM and a graphics card, and do you have a gaming PC? Well, there's only one way to find out, and that is in the benchmarks. Starting off the benchmarks, we were going to be running GTA 5 with the Enhanced Edition because I genuinely don't think there'd be any problems running it here. Unfortunately, the Linux install managed to completely delete all of my games files for it, and being a 125GB download, well, we're going to be downloading it for a long time. In fact, it's still downloading while I do this voiceover the following day. Either way, we saw an average in the legacy version of 48 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 36 FPS. This was a limit pretty much entirely imposed on the system by the processor, and it did struggle to keep up with the graphics card in some places, which was churning out ultra settings without even struggling. So when it comes to GTA 5, well, provided you don't mind an experience that would probably be best if you were using a FreeSync monitor, well, you can enjoy it with very high settings. When it came to the online version of GTA 5 though, things were quite intense with those ultra settings in 1080p, and the Core i5 was definitely showing its age a little bit, struggling to manage much more than 30 FPS a lot of the time. Now, it was still a playable experience and one that would definitely benefit from you externally capping the frame rate using something like MSI Afterburner, but for the most part you could still enjoy these large lobbies completely fine. It's worth noting that in smaller lobbies it actually ran better than the single player experience, so if you were playing this just with friends, you could be seeing anywhere from 40 to 60 FPS, but if you're playing in a fully packed out 32 player lobby, as our benchmark tends to be, well, you're going to be seeing closer to around the 30 FPS mark, but it'll look good at least. Now, this one really did surprise me. Counter-Strike 2, when using competitive settings, even with what is now an ancient Core i5, well, it was able to manage 125 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 96 FPS. It's worth noting the R9 Fury still had plenty to give in this title, even though it doesn't particularly like running at 1080p, it mostly prefers to run at higher resolutions. But still, through the rather intensive workshop benchmark, we were seeing over 100 FPS a lot of the time, and it would very rarely stray anywhere away from this figure even when lots was going on. In terms of actual competitive gameplay, well, on average you'd be seeing around 150 to 170 FPS, purely because there isn't as much going on as there is in this benchmark. So the Core i5 can manage some decently competitive Counter-Strike 2 gaming, even in a basic system like this. Now, for these older systems, people have requested to see City Skylines, the original one, quite a lot. And here, with very high settings in 1080p, once the game had eventually stabilised, we saw around 38 FPS on average. Now, the game did take a few seconds to load in things like overlays or menus, but once it had done that once, well, it tended to work absolutely fine and the hitching would disappear. This did this no matter how many times you relaunch the game, so when you first start playing, you're better off getting all the menus open and out of the way if you don't want to spend your time watching the game stutter for a second. Either way, I had no problems playing the game and got quite a lot of gameplay footage, so City Skylines, well, even on the old Core i5, it was fine from the get-go. Now, Baldur's Gate 3 really is a brutal test for a system like this. It's one of those games that has major problems with the R9 Fury because the Vulkan mode will just crash, so you're stuck with the DirectX 11 mode with no driver-side optimization, so it struggles to maintain anything in regards to a good utilization amount, which meant that we capped our frame rate at 30 FPS. Not that it made too much of a difference, because this Core i5, despite how good it is, you're better off capping this game to 30 FPS even if you've got a graphics card that can manage this game better. Honestly, this is a shame that I wasn't testing on Linux, because I was dead curious to find out how well this game would run when given an operating system that would let the graphics card actually use Vulkan. But still, we can't complain too much, and I suppose if this is all you could have as an option to play the game, then maybe you could get away with it. Another one that I knew was going to put a ton of load on the processor was Cyberpunk 2077. We've seen that it runs absolutely fine on the R9 Nano, and it was definitely something weird going on here with the PCI Express bandwidth or something like that, because the utilization seemed to be all over the place, bouncing between 50 to 100% almost at random. In the benchmark, it seemed completely playable with 37 FPS on average, but when we actually went in-game, we did have to physically cap our frame rate to 30 just so we could maintain a somewhat playable experience. And it's worth noting that despite how much the frame rate would bounce around between 23 and 30 FPS, the game was still very controllable with not much in the way of noticeable latency. So I wouldn't exactly call it a fantastic experience, but it was definitely a good test of how the hardware is having some weird issues in brand new titles. Now, BeamNG did certainly take its time to load in on the older Core i5 system, but once we had everything all set up and working, well, it wasn't exactly too much of a struggle with very high settings in the most intensive jungle benchmark map, actually giving us 34 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 28 FPS. Now, when there was lots of foliage present on screen, you could see it drop beneath 30 FPS, often hovering around 29 FPS, but honestly, you could resolve this by turning down a couple of the options down to high, or you could, just play a different map if you want to use the very high settings. Really, BeamNG was putting a lot of strain on both components here, and once the Core i5 had been, toned down a little bit and everything had loaded in, it was actually dealing with things here really well, and we actually saw the R9 Nano become the limit. I don't think this was the full limit of the R9 Nano, as we've seen it perform better than this, but once again, it is also being thrown into quite an old system. Mount & Blade Bannerlord, once again the pinnacle of optimization in the modern day, running with high and very high settings in 1080p. We saw the game return 62 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 41 FPS, with the processor actually handling the large battle benchmark surprisingly well for an old 4-core. The R9 Nano wasn't really struggling at all here and can manage the game with higher settings and a higher resolution. But there you go, Bannerlord ran completely fine, and I wasn't really surprised to see it run this well on a system like that. When it came to Hitman 3, performance tended to be pretty good, but we did have to stick with the base simulation options and the medium settings, purely because the i5 was really struggling when you turn things up much higher than this. But still, with medium settings in 1080p, the game did look really good, and if you had a higher resolution display, I could have plugged one in to be honest, you could quite easily play this game at higher resolutions without seeing any difference in the frame rate. Either way, we saw 61 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 46 FPS, leading to a very playable time overall. But this one is always a weird one. When it comes to testing Fallout 4, it doesn't matter what system you're testing on, there seems to be very little in the way of repeatability when actually trying to get performance figures out of it. We did see the game was playable with high settings in 1080p, but don't expect much more than 30 FPS when you're in built-up areas, towns and cities, or combat. When not much was going on, or you were inside areas, well, you could see 60 FPS nearly completely locked. But for the vast majority of the time, the system could handle it okay, but 30 to 40 FPS is what you should be expecting out of the system. So the overall performance. Well, we definitely have a clear GPU bottleneck, even with this thing running, well, undervolted and underclocked. In fact, I did limit the performance of the graphics card, purely just for efficiency reasons. I did test it again without, and it made very little difference. I genuinely think there's some weird things going on with the PCIe speed, but then again, this is an older L55 Dell XPS system. And it does go to show that you can actually play some of the most popular titles out there, as long as you're willing to compromise on settings so that the processor's got time to catch up with what's going on. It's a shame that a couple of the games I did want to test were completely corrupted. I did manage to re-download Counter-Strike 2 in time, but PUBG was completely corrupted, and GTA 5 Enhanced Edition was completely corrupted by our experiments earlier. So I'm still waiting on both of those to re-download as we speak. But genuinely, I think it handled those fine, because both have a DirectX 12 mode, and that's kind of what benefits this system quite a lot, is how well that R9 Fury deals with DirectX 12, and how well it helps spread the load out on that Core i5. But performance overall, I'd say it's fairly admirable for just chucking a graphics card in a pre-built PC. I have absolutely no idea what the point of this video was. It has ended up as a lot of tinkering and everything going wrong, which I should have expected given we were essentially chucking a modern day Linux distro and then trying to import my games onto the system and a whole load of nonsense. A big learning lesson has came from today's video about building just a dedicated Linux system and not trying to utilize the games you've got on hand, because it can go wrong and it will go wrong. And in this case, everything went completely wrong. But I suppose something we did learn out of this is, can the age-old strategy of taking an old Dell pre-built PC, be it Dell, HP, Lenovo, one of these old workstation units, and chucking in a graphics card still get you by? Well, I'd say it definitely can, and I mean, you definitely don't need a graphics card as good as the R9 Fury. That really was completely overkill for a system like this. I mean, maybe a 1050 Ti would make a lot more sense, or at least an equivalent AMD card to one of those as long as you could get it to boot. I did try a Polaris card, and I had absolutely no luck with it in this system given it's completely non-UEFI. But there we go. I have no clue what purpose this video serves. I am struggling to think of any other ways of putting it, but I hope you've all enjoyed what has been a very painful troubleshooting session, and just the things that can go wrong sometimes when you're messing about with these random projects. So thank you all very much for watching. I've certainly learnt a lot today, and good night.